Much indeed, Mark, and a very warm welcome to everybody attending this meeting. We now have 107 participants, and that number is still increasing. We all look forward to a very good presentation this afternoon on the classics of the United States. That presentation, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Gordon Eubanks, as well as being a fellow of this society. He's a board member of the Classics Society, a member of the American Philatelic Society, the Collectors Clubs of New York and Chicago, and other organizations. He is a highly successful exhibitor, has 2 Champion of Champion awards in the United States, 2 international large gold medals, and he was awarded the Grand Prix National at the New York International Exhibition in 2016. His subject today is the first issue of the United States, the stamps and how they were used. And it's my great pleasure to hand over now to Gordon for his presentation. Over to you, Gordon, and thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I can't overemphasize what an honor it is to present to the Royal. I only wish it was a time we could do this in person. One of my greatest experiences was presenting a few years ago, and you guys should be amazingly proud of what you continue to accomplish. So today I'm going to talk about the 47 issue in the United States. It's a big topic, so I'm not going to cover all the possible aspects. I'm not going to get into plate and printing varieties in any detail, or local and uses of the stamp. Those are whole hour topics in themselves. But I do want to cover how the stamps were made and used over the 4 years they were allowed to be used. So the US was kind of a laggard in stamps. The UK, of course, was the leader and really took the right approach. It took the US until 55 to actually require stamps to be prepaid, or 56 to be mandatory use for letter mail. So it was a slow and political process. I think the best I've seen on explaining all this is the Grimwood-Taylor book that is published, I believe, by the Royal. It's a great book. It really covers in a way that's readable how this all occurred, not just in the UK or Europe, but in the US. The US part is really excellent. But in 1847, on the 1st of June, these stamps were put on sale to the public. They were made on unhardened steel engraved plates, 200, and had 2 identical panes per plate. These are 2 beautiful examples. I like things that have names, like the Newbury corner copies. The thing about engraving is that each stamp in a way is unique, and the 10-cent stamp was plated by Perry, actually, as he was on a ship going from New York to England. He had a large group of 47 10-cent with him, and he plated them. The 5-cent have not been plated, but many varieties are identified in these plates, just like in any engraved set of stamps. Here's some pretty multiples. The one on the left, top left, has a great story. It was discovered in a Bible. Someone had stuck it in there. There's a bigger block of 5-cent, a block of 16, and a few strips. But big blocks are really uncommon, as they are with most first issue stamps. There are no sheets, there are no large, there's rumored to be a very large piece of 5 cent, but there are no pictures of it. People who tell me it's actually exists, but very small, large pieces. These are the two largest multiples recorded on a cover. Unfortunately, both of them have a flaw. The top one, you can see someone not thinking of us 100 and some years later managed to rip a corner off it. This is an interesting cover because it pays 50 cents of the what would be 60 cent due. And you can see here with the arrow, the 10 that's written, that's ink 10, and then the paid saying that it was fully paid. The one below, we're going to talk more about these Panama stamp, Panama covers that went through Panama, but this went from Peru to Panama where the American stamps were placed on it, but this cover never entered the US mail. It was dropped off along Mexico, and there's a couple others in this correspondence or in this route. Unfortunately, underneath, this is a replaced stamp, and underneath is the stamp has been partially ripped off. I cannot find, I couldn't find a color copy. It says on the cert that this was hinged on, but I didn't want to take the risk of trying to move it or remove it to picture what's underneath. But this was replaced to make the cover look better. So one question that took a long time to resolve was the question in the printing of were there really 200 on the plate cut into 2 panes of 100? And this is the proof. You can see here this straddle between the 2 plates. These are the 3 existing pieces that show that. You can see it just barely down here and up here. These, this one, you might wonder about the postmark. This was actually folded under the stamp and discovered when someone unfolded it. I believe Wade Soddy was the first person to have all 3 of these pieces, and he wrote about it. Wade's done a tremendous amount of work on the 47s, and he wrote an article for the Chronicle on these 3 pieces. But it put to rest the question of whether it was a plate of 100 or a plate of 200. It took a while also to resolve that there was only 1 plate of each stamp. And I think now everyone agrees that's the case, but there was a time when you'll read older publications that talk about the second plate of the 5 cent. Over the years, a lot of work's been done on the different shades of the 5 cent stamp, and the 5 cent stamp wore really badly. You can see, I'm going to show you in a minute a better picture of it, but you can see here compared to up here how much it wore. Scott Treppel, in an article in the Current Chronicle, has put together the wear on the plates and the colors that occurred. I call it the unified theory, but he doesn't like that term. But it's really, it's interesting when you begin to look at it this way. In the US, people identify dozens of shades, and I think that blurs the picture. I think it's not that important, all these obscure shades with kind of strange names. What really happened is that the way the ink was mixed did affect the printing, and there was more of the orange in later printings, more of the orange, red orange, brown oranges, and more of the red, brown, dark browns up in earlier printings. And I think that's what's really important in the shades and the wear. The 10-cent stamp didn't wear, they weren't used as much, there were not as many printed, but they also, their ink composition didn't lend itself to wear like the 5-cent. One theory that was believed for a long time was that the ink was changed to include more chromium as later printings occurred. That's not true. It's been shown by analytical analysis with this new fancy machines that there is no chrome. These are all lead ink based stamps, every one, every shade, every color, every printing. And here is a little better idea of the wear. So if you look at the plate proof here and up here, you see these fine lines. You can see as you go down in the printings, and the plate clearly wore. This is and the plate was cleaned at this point here, and the clean plate was a little better. You can see a little more of the lines, but compare it to this early printing here where you can really see the lines. And so the 5-cent, like I said, lots of shades that people want to talk about. I think the important thing is to focus on these shades and these printings. And that's what's, in my mind, important about this issue. Here's some examples of shades and pairs from early and late printings. Less common are the red-orange. I started putting some of the better pieces in red, but I thought I removed them all. I clearly didn't. This is less common. This is a clean plate. I couldn't find a nice pair of the clean plate, but this is what exists, and all the other shades are just deviants of or just a little off these basic shades. One thing I'm not going to talk about all the plate varieties, but the stamp on the right is a type C double transfer. And I won't go into, you can see there's a double transfer down here, but what's important is that when they clean the plate, the type C and D were introduced. There's never been a type C or D transfer found in an earlier printing of the stamps. So this gives us some indication of what the color, good indication of what the color in the plate was like after the cleaning, because we know these C and D transfers came from that later state. I just wanted to show this cover because I think it's beautiful. It's a use of the stamps from Canada. We're going to talk about that later, but this is the intermediate printing of the stamps, and on a pretty cover from Canada. So the stamps were delivered to New York City on 1 July. I believe they were given the order to make the plates in late May, early June, and it's amazing how quickly in those days people actually got work done. The government authorized stamps in March, and they had plates in June and started printing. Hard to imagine something like that happening today. I mean, we'd had in the US, there'd probably be 10 court cases on whether we should really have stamps or not. The one on the left is the earliest recorded use of a 5-cent, which is 7 July. And the one below is an early example of the 10 July. The earliest known use is a 2 July, which is in the National Postal Museum on long-term loan from Bill Gross. It's a 2 December, a 2 July 47 cover. The stamps were delivered to Boston on the 2nd, to Philadelphia and Washington on the 7th, Washington the 9th. There's about 65 envelopes covers with one of these stamps or both recorded in July of 47. There's an interesting article in the Current Chronicle about why it took a while for people to start using stamps. But in the US, when these stamps were put on sale, they were not mandatory. Prepayment was not mandatory. And it took a while to get there. So was less use early on. And this issue, they were never mandatory with this issue. Prepayment was never mandatory. So I'm not going to go and explain every one of these rates, but there's a fair number of different domestic rates that were in effect. I think we'll cover each one in some detail, but not a lot. This cover was owned by Harvey Mirsky and others. It's in a couple of older books. It's a shame that someone let it get wet. They probably spilled wine or something on it. But this is an extremely interesting cover, because here's a cover that uses both stamps independently to pay a valid rate at the time. So the reason for that was, in the United States, when a letter was forwarded, you had to pay full postage. So this letter, the 10-cent stamp paid the over 300-mile postage to Albany, and from Albany it went to Albion, and that forwarding was paid by 5 cents. It went to a politician who was serving in the state government in New York. So forwarded, both stamps, same rate, used for their particular rate, independent of each other. It's not a pretty cover, but very cool. So under 300 miles, for a while, the government said nothing about bisecting. They never said it was legal, but they eventually, with the next issue of stamps, did say it was illegal. But in the US, they were used occasionally. These two covers here, the diagonal cut is a matched pair. So I don't think it being a matched pair maybe really makes it more important, but it certainly makes it more expensive. But it's kind of cool. I've done some research on the bisects, and an interesting question is, why are most of the vertical ones cut this way? And my theory is that they hold the stamp in most people are right-handed, they hold it in their left hand and cut. It would be more awkward to do it the other diagonal. Of course, that's just my theory on this, but I think the data supports that. This is the only horizontal bisect, and it's on a piece that is, I'm sorry, there's one in the Postal Museum that may or may not be a genuine. So the question is, well, why wouldn't they have done horizontal? And my theory on this is that this top piece does not show the rate. It doesn't show that this is 10 cents. Now, of course, everyone knew that that was a 10-cent stamp, even if it's the top half, but there are there are no full covers that really show this. There are vertical bisects. There are quite a number of those. And here's another double rate cover that I particularly like from the south, from Georgia, that shows paying the double rate under 300 miles. This is within Georgia. So over 300 miles, here's two examples paying the over 300 mile, the single 10-cent rate and the double 10-cent rate. This is a correspondence that has whatever those numbers add up to, 50 some different covers in the correspondence. They're very popular because the writer would overlap the stamps, or that's what attracts people to them. So most of these weren't overlapping, but there are a few. They're quite attractive. The interesting thing here is that Mark Shearer, a New York collector, did extensive research on this family, found a book where one of the sons had written a book about their parents and why the husband, the father, was in St. Louis while his mother, still before they were married, was in Boston. And Mark's done a lot of research on this correspondence. Double rate and single rate over 300 miles. Sorry. So here's another double rate over 300 miles from Boston to Pennsylvania. It's interesting, these plate scratches in here. I have been trying to get a great explanation as to why these scratches occur. These are more scratches than the both other plates both other panes put together. Of all 200 stamps of the 10-cent value, these are the most of any scratches, and the scratches don't go across onto the stamp. So if someone who's an expert on engraving wants to drop me a note, I'm interested as how this could happen. Meanwhile, this is a cover that was sent by an express mail train. The reason that's interesting is the government was getting private competition in carrying mail. So they established what they called express trains between Boston, New York, Philadelphia, to improve their service. Now, in fact, nothing changed in the service but the name. So they continued to say, well, we have express mail, when actually they're the same mail. Then they used a better strategy and outlawed all the other private carriers. Here's a strip of 4, which is less common, paying the double rate over 300 miles domestically. There are not a lot of strips like this paying these rates. And this is another interesting cover. Boston if this was a double rate, paid a single rate, and Boston would write this unpaid in crayon. And in this case, they marked that 20 was what was, I apologize very much, the 20-cent hand stamp. What's interesting here is that this was an old hand stamp that they had, which was 20 3/4, and they removed the 3/4 from the hand stamp and now started using it as a 20 and it's got this flat space here that identifies it. I think there are three examples of this hand stamp in existence. So during this period, the US had a triple rate. A triple rate would be between 1 ounce and 1.5 ounce. These are two examples, another express mail example, and a under 300 and over 300 miles. The government stopped this triple rate because it was inconsistent with the way the British were and Canadians handled multiple rates. So in Canada and Great Britain, there was the 1/2 ounce, the 1 ounce, and then it went in 1 ounce increments. And this caused some problem. Later, I'm going to show a cover where it actually has both rates on it, the Canadian rate and the US rate. But so the triple rate is less common, but there are covers after 3 March that tried to pay the triple rate. They didn't understand, and they were underpaid, and but abandoned the triple rate in March, less than 2 years. And the sort of final letter rate in the US was the 40-cent rate, which was originally from the East Coast to Oregon. California was not part of the United States when this in 47. And they then established California post offices, and this rate applied to California. This is not the prettiest cover, but it's unique. It's the only cover used from San Francisco going east in this period with the 40-cent rate. San Francisco has never issued stamps, so someone had to carry these stamps from the east and then apply them to a letter, or more likely, this well-known firm sent stamps out and asked them to use them to reply, send back information. As well as letter rates, the US had circular and drop rates. So these are an example of a circular and a drop rate applied with a 5-cent stamp, overpaying it. So this would overpay the 2-cent drop rate, and this overpays the 3-cent circular rate. Now, how do I know that this is a drop letter and a circular? And the answer is I really don't know. This originated in Pennsylvania along a canal and was most likely carried privately because it entered the mail in Baltimore. I could argue that it still should have had a 5-cent stamp on it. It had a 2-cent marking. It's treated as a drop letter. This is viewed as a drop letter overpaid, but and the same with the circular, you don't know that inserted in the circular was a letter with the circular, and therefore requiring the 5-cent stamp anyway. I'm not saying this to degrade these covers, and if you're ever judging my exhibit, please don't take it that way. But I think honestly, it's really difficult to tell that these two pieces, one way or another, but it's certainly a circular, and it certainly got dropped in Baltimore. But it originated in Pennsylvania. So here's another strange, or sort of hard to know for sure what happened. So in the United States, we had a way fee where if you were a ship that was carrying mail, or you were a stagecoach, you could pick up letters along the way and deliver them to the post office, and the post office would give you 1 penny, and then the post office would charge the recipient 1 penny. Note there's no 1 penny charge marked on here. So that's one mystery about this cover. This cover was also forwarded. So it would have to pay the forwarding postage, which in this case would be 5 cents from Norfolk to Washington. So my theory on this cover is that the sender knew that it would have to be forwarded, but didn't know where to forward it to. So they put 2 stamps on to be sure it would get there. And the post office in Virginia I apologize for this. The Mac mouse is very sensitive. My theory that the postmaster then in Virginia and in Washington said, well, we got all the right money, so we're just going to accept these 2 stamps. I believe they were canceled in Washington with the X's, and in Norfolk with the X's, and in Washington with the red grid. I can't explain the way and why the 1 cent way fee wasn't collected or charged. I don't have a great explanation, but it was apparently applied in Norfolk the way, recognizing that it was delivered by either a ship or a stage of some sort, stagecoach. Anyway, some of these are really interesting and hard to decipher. Here's another interesting forwarded cover. This was sent to Baltimore and then to Washington from Sandy Springs, Maryland. What's interesting here is this is a Quaker community, Sandy Springs. It's still, Sandy Spring is still there. This is Quaker dating. I don't know if you've heard of this, but the 7th month, the 28th day, the Quakers believed that the days, the months were demonic. They represented the devil. I'm probably not doing it justice, and I don't mean to say it in a negative way. That's what they believed. And so any Quaker dated community, any Quaker community, the postmarks were done this way, 7th month instead of July. The 5 is the forwarding fee on to Washington, or Washington City as it was called in those days. And it was accepted in Baltimore. Now, the postmaster that handled this in Baltimore was in Sandy Springs. The postmaster was also an engraver and did most of the government's seals. And when his house was sold sometime in this last century, they found all these seals that he'd made for different government organizations. Anyway, very good story. This is a unique situation in the 47 period, that in Wheeling, Virginia, there was no West Virginia at this time because the Civil War, West Virginia split off, and with the North, and Virginia, of course, was with the South. But you see this control mark obviously applied to 4 stamps at a time. There are very few known, and it's not clear why they did this. There are different theories. So my theory is that the postmaster was either having trouble with theft or feared theft, and marked them this way so that he could have better control of the stamps. They couldn't be used anywhere but Wheeling once this mark was on it, because it looked like a used stamp. So another theory would be that he sold these to people with accounts and then would use this to know to debit their account. I'm not sure I believe that, but there's no data to say one way or another. One cover was fairly recently discovered in a desk drawer, which was entered the mail and was mailed and has no other cancel on it, which could lead people to say this was a pre-cancel and they sold them to people and to use, and where they wouldn't have to cancel them. The net is there's not very many of them, but interesting. There were not many unusual fancy cancels used in this period. Later in the 51 period and really in the 60s, 1860s, the US had a remarkable number of different fancy cancels. But in the 47 period, most cancels were very straightforward. This was a standard cancel. And this is just beautiful. I believe this is a stamp on the initial slide. I believe I scanned it from this cover. Wow. So here is one fancy cancel in Trenton, New Jersey. This star is not very common, but it is a legitimate use of a fancy cancel. There are also covers that had pre-stamp mail rate markings that were used in the 47 period, but this is this is a fancy cancel. The postmaster obviously had some time on his hands and carved a star and did a very good job, I might add. So in the UK, you had a lot of really awesome illustrated covers. As envelopes became more popular and as people were expected to prepay postage, advertising moved to envelopes. So this is a really, I think, amazing example of manufacturer advertising their business with covers. I believe this was the first cover that Mirsky bought, but I sometimes get this wrong. But I believe he saw an advertisement for a Harvey saw this advertisement for an auction, went to the auction and bought this cover. If that's not true, it's a great story. But a beautiful illustrated cover, very unusual in this period, extremely more common as time goes on. And really into the World War II, after World War II in the 50s, there are a lot of illustrated US covers. Until television really took off for marketing, these were used as a way for businesses to market. And still you see them occasionally. This is my favorite illustrated envelope, maybe my favorite 47 cover. This is a political, it was to market it, it was used to advertise a newspaper to help represent and defend and support Native American rights. A gentleman had bought these covers from the UK, J. Valentine, I believe, of Dundee, did this engraving. It's incredibly beautiful. And he sold them to the gentleman in the US. He had as a kid, he wasn't in Native American, but he lived as a child with a Native American tribe and grew up actually in Canada and grew up. So it was a Native Canadian tribe and Native North American tribe. And he had a lifelong effort in Indian affairs and supporting Native American causes. The stamp is a red-orange used on cover. It's a beautiful. One thing I'll say about this cover is that I shouldn't scan these at such high resolution. I think they look much better in person. So the US had an interest in Panama, an increasing interest, because as the gold rush developed in California, Panama was one of the most common and one of the routes to get there. It wasn't really a good idea to cross the US in those days on land. It's dangerous and it was long, and people went down to Panama. They went to the Caribbean, to Aspinwall and Shargs. I never pronounce this right, Shargs something. And then to Panama City and up to San Francisco. When people see this map, which I borrowed from DeVos's book, they're surprised how this is so north-south. I think a lot of people think of Panama as going, these routes as being east-west. Chartres was a booming town at that time, gambling, prostitution. The miners would come through and stay here for a while, catch a boat then to San Francisco. So the US had two rates. They had a rate from Aspinwall, which was 20 cents, and they had a rate from Panama, which was Panama City, at 30 cents. This is the only recorded copy of the 20-cent rate. Went on a steamship to New York and then on to Ohio. And the 30-cent is a little more common, and it went to Philadelphia, crossed and went to Philadelphia. So that would start here, and then go up into Philadelphia, up to New York and on to Philadelphia. These rates are fairly uncommon. There's a dozen, maybe 30-cent rates. Earlier, you saw the triple rate, the one that had 90 cents and 10-cent stamps with the one ripped off, which is the largest number of 10-cent stamps. But these, like I said, it's about a dozen covers from the Panama area from Panama in this period. Also, there was incoming ship mail. Again, I think there are two, I know of two covers that pay the 2 cents fee. This is particularly interesting because this letter started in New Brunswick, carried by ship to Eastport, entered the mail as a ship letter, 2 cents due to the captain. The 10-cent stamp paid the over 300-mile rate to the exchange office at Queenston, where it re-entered Canada and delivered Hamilton with the 4.5 pence due on delivery. So I think that's pretty cool. A very interesting letter, but Canada using the US effectively to get this delivered to Hamilton and Canada West. So now I want to shift now. We could, there's hundreds of cool covers in the US, but I want to take some of the time we have to talk about the international rates. I'm not going to go through all these. There were not a lot of treaties at that time. At this time, eventually we had the British Convention. There was some ability to get to with French mail. So this is a triple rate letter that went to Canada. Went to New York from Canada in prior to 6 April of 51. That's when the a treaty agreement with Canada went in place. So here's an example where the Canadian postmasters had some 10-cent stamps that were sent to Canada for this purpose. So someone would pay the 1 shilling 6 in Canada to get to the US border, and then the 30 cents paid the triple rate to get to the to New York. The Canadian postage of 1 shilling 6D was actually the quad rate because Canada did not have a 1 to 1.5 ounce rate. So this pays 2 different rates in 2 different countries and the triple rate. It is not a strip of 3. If I said that earlier, that was wrong, but it's a pair and a single stamp. I think this is a really extraordinary cover. Now, on 6 April, an agreement put in place with Canada that there could be a through rate. So we no longer had to pay to the border and from the border, but rather we could pay a through rate. And this is a first day example of that. I don't understand why the sender was so careless in his cutting when we would really have appreciated a straighter cut, but a very, very nice, unique cover for 6 April, paying the 10-cent rate to Hamilton from New York. And we got to show this cover. There was nothing that said that this 10-cent rate couldn't be paid by part Canadian and part US stamps. Nothing said it could be. And in 51, they did say in the next rate period, they did say, or the next rate, they did say it clearly could not be paid by 2 stamps. By the way, they still did, but they weren't legitimate uses. This is a legitimate use, paid in Canada with someone put a 5 and a 10 and a cent and a 3 pence beaver on the cover and sent it to New York, where it was completely accepted. Plus, it's a beautiful cover. There are 3 beaver covers. This one, there's one from New York that goes to Canada with the same combination of stamps. And then there's one which has nothing to do with this through rate, which goes from Canada with a beaver and 5 5-cent stamps to the UK. That cover is not paying this through rate. The beaver pays to the border, and from there, the 25 cents is a 1 cent overpayment of the rate, C rate to Canada, to the United Kingdom. So clearly a beautiful cover. Here is another interesting Canada cover. I'm maybe running a little late on time here. This this cover went to Pictou, Nova Scotia From Boston, the letter traveled to Eastport, probably on the Admiral, transferred to a private ship, the Maid of Erin, which took it to St. John, where it entered the Canadian mails as a ship letter with this 2-line hand stamp. The ship letter, there's 2 of these in existence. One was in the Bill Gross collection, and I had one. We'll look at that again. The steamboat hand stamp applied in, I believe, Boston, but I'm sure Mark Schwartz can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And it paid the appropriate fees. The 1 shilling 4 was 4.5 ship fee and 11.5 inland rate to Pickatoo. I'm at awe at how they really were able to reasonably quickly get mail through very tough conditions and over land and by ship. This is another unusual cover. So in the summer, mail went across here to Prince Edward Island here on where the red summer route. But in the winter, they took the short, and most of this water was filled with ice. So they had ice boats, and this is a picture, kind of a dramatic picture, but they would carry the mail and passengers across in these boats. And then when they came to these ice, they would drag the boats across the ice to get the passengers and mail to Prince Edward Island. And I understand you got a discount if you're willing to help pull the boat, if you were a passenger. I think everyone had to offload. And then if you volunteered to pull, you got a discount. There's a museum, I believe, somewhere in Prince Edward Island, I meant to look this up, that about these ice boats, but tremendous interesting history. I don't believe there's any other covers that went in the winter across this route. There may be, but it's an unusual and very great story. So there's a little understood convention of 1844 with New Grenada, where Panama is, for the Navy to carry mail bags and then transport them across the isthmus and turn them over to the British mail, which delivered this to Chile. This is the ship rate, and this is the getting it delivered to the person. This was sent to a officer on a ship that was on an, as it says, an astronomical. Anyway, they're doing some astronomy work in South America. Another one of my truly favorite covers. This is to England before the Postal Convention of 1844. This is a double rate letter and has the 2 shilling mark. I believe there's no other US letters with that marking. It's just a beautiful, I consulted with some English collectors that had done some work on this hand stamp, but really a beautiful cover that is the way mail was sent before the convention. Here's another one I'll look at quickly. This is, to me, another beautiful cover. I didn't talk about the colored cancels. Orange is pretty rare in the US, but this is just another example of a letter that's in great condition, but paid before the convention. Now, here's a circular that's overpaid. We talked about the domestic circular. Here's a circular to Scotland. And we know that this is a valid overpayment because the British accepted this as a circular and charged 2p for it. So that's pretty good evidence that they would have charged a shilling if it had a letter in it or writing or something. So that's an example of a circular from the US. Okay, after the, when the treaty with the UK went into effect, all the ships carrying mail to the UK were British ships. And the US wanted to get into this business. And so the US started to use their contract ships to carry transatlantic mail. The British position was that mail to the UK or through the UK was their responsibility, and they would not accept any payment from that the US had applied to such mail. So this was a lot of money, right? This 35 cents in those days, that was like real money. And this prepayment was ignored. So this went to Belgium, but the retaliatory issues were the issues through the UK. Ever since I was collecting, I'd always wanted this cover. It was owned by Steve Walsky, owned by Gross. It's just a beautiful cover that reflects the reality. Now, the retaliatory period got huge pushback from merchants on both sides that thought it was a lot of BS. I mean, you know, let's get real here. You guys need to get this figured out because it's costing us a lot of money in the meantime. So it got resolved pretty quickly, but during the period, it was interesting, create some great covers. So a lot of the mail from the US went by British open mail under this convention of 1848. And the not, I think, well appreciated, the British mail system really gave the US access to most of the world. And it would work by paying the 5 cents to get it on the ship, and then the recipient would pay the full postage. So this is, I think, the only cover to Italy, and there's a couple to Switzerland, but this convention allowed people to reach all across Europe and beyond with using the British system. So I'm going to end this, not too late, too much over time. When the US decided to reduce the rates and issue a new set of stamps on 1 July 1851, for reasons that are not really clear, they demonetized the stamps. They said these stamps were no longer valid for postage. They had a somewhat difficult process to turn them in for cash. You know, you're supposed to take them to the post office that you bought them from, and you know, this is government, right? You know, make it complicated. But these are two covers used on the last day of legal use of these stamps. And we'll take one more look at these stamps. And finally, while people had the stamps, they could have turned them in at the post office they bought them in. They were often used. And in general, postmasters, using good common sense, accepted them, saying, this guy paid 5 cents, or this woman paid 5 cents for this stamp. They only need to pay 3 cents. I'm going to accept these letters. So there are examples where the postmaster didn't accept them. They're usually much, much later. This is I love this cover because it's the first day of the new rate of 3 cents, and it was accepted for postage. And with that, I'm going to stop and again tell you how honored I am to talk to the Royal. There's lots of aspects of the 47 that we didn't talk about that are also very interesting. The local delivery issues with local companies, and then also all the issues around plate and printing varieties. But again, I really appreciate it, and love to answer some questions.
Gordon, may I, on behalf of everybody, express our sincere thanks for the excellence of your presentation, the magnificence of the material that you've shown us. The condition is quite exceptional, I think, and I think everybody will share that view, for items of that antiquity. It's a fascinating story. Thank you very much indeed. We now move on to questions, and this will be managed by Mark Bailey. And Mark, I will now hand over to you to deal with that aspect of the afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. And yes, thank you very much, Gordon, for a wonderful display, and with some fascinating covers. So I wasn't worried about the time, and I think the rest of us are as well. So that's fine. Thank you very much. I'd like to start then with some questions that have come in. The first one comes from, let me just get this right for you. Yes, Keith Burton asked the first question. He asked, is it known how many of each value were printed and how many went into circulation?
It is known, and I have it right here on this piece of paper. There's about 4.4 million 5-cent stamps that were distributed. They printed, I'm sorry, there are 4.4 million printed and 3.5 million were used. The rest were turned in and destroyed. For the 10-cent, there are about 800,000 that were distributed for use in the U.S. I want to thank the comments from Richard. I think I feel very lucky to have covers that are in great condition, and some of them are quite rare, but it's really the story that makes them interesting, and all the covers that tell great stories don't have to have these other aspects to them to be really worth collecting.
That's very true. And it's on the subject of the covers that we have the next question. This comes from Patrick Reed. He would like to know, are there any statistics on the volume of stamped covers in 1847 and the subsequent years?
Wow, I could have paid for that question. So it turns out that the Classic Society has an extensive census with very strong search capabilities that has virtually all the known covers. Mark Shearer, remember I talked to him about the Turner covers. He has put together and managed this census for a number of years. And you can search it if you want to know how many 5-cent covers went to New York. Boom. Yeah, it's quite. Now, if the question is how many in total are in the census, I don't have that at the top of my head.
Okay.
But Alexander, Mr. Alexander, forget his first name, he did an amazing book. It's about this thick, which he did on the census of the 47s. I mean, to put this together at the time he did without all the computer technology is pretty amazing. But bringing these census from print to the computer allows them to be dynamic. And so that's my plug for the Classic Society, which is, and this is free, by the way. You don't have to belong to use the census.
Right. Thank you. Mike Hoffman asked a question. You used a particular term when you were explaining about some of the letters. You referred to a drop letter. Could you just elaborate, please? What is a drop letter?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. I should have done that. In the US, if you took a letter to the post office and it was delivered to someone that was in that post office, it was a drop letter and you paid, in this period, 2 cents instead of the 5 cents. So there was no real delivery services in general. People went to the post office to deliver mail and went to the post office to get their mail. So a drop letter was dropped off there. The particular letter I showed traveled on a boat from a canal in Pennsylvania down to Baltimore, and then it was entered the post office as a drop rate. But mostly it's people, you want to write a letter to your sister that lives in the same town, you took it to the post office and paid the drop rate.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Philip Ward, who would like to know about the date stamps that you've, obviously all of the covers had date stamps on. He said, how was the year shown? He didn't see any year in the date stamps.
The postal requirements did not require a year, so there were no year dates shown. And the way you have to get a year date is either a date line on the letter or someone wrote received on some day, but the dates were not required. Yesterday, when Wade gave his talk at the Collectors Club, he showed some of the first hand stamps that actually included years, but they were never required until much later, if ever. They certainly are never required in the Classic period. And so you sometimes don't know the year of a letter from 1847 or the 51 series.
Okay. Simon Moorcroft asks, given the variety of cancellations, were there any directions provided to postmasters around the use or design of these, or was it just left to local areas?
Well, it was both. The post office told you how to cancel a stamp, to kill a stamp, and their concern was reuse. So they told you to do one of two things. If you were a big enough post office, they sent you a grid cancel. A grid cancel was a circle which people normally canceled in red or black. Or you were to take a pen and put an X or a cross across the stamp. Not being very considerate of future collectors, they did not require you to tie the stamp on the cover. Very inconsiderate. Those were the two ways the post office told you. Now, postmasters, of course, did their own thing. You know, these were independent American entrepreneurs, and they did it a variety of ways.
Okay, thank you.
And they were also required to put the date stamp with the month and the day that it left the post office. So every once in a while you see a cover with two date stamps, like the 3rd of May and then the 4th of May, because it didn't actually leave on the 3rd of May. So they did it again. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, good. Thank you for that very good explanation. You mentioned plate scratches, and you showed us the piece you have. Philip Ward mentions plate scratches between the stamps. He said on GB stamps of this period, similar marks arising from the plate metal ridging when a stamp unit was re-entered into the plate, so that because that caused the metal to lift. So this is about
that's very interesting.
Yeah, about re-entering a stamp unit into the plate.
The two stamps in my example are not stamps that we are aware were re-entered. They could have been, and we have no indication. You know, generally when you re-enter or as we call it, double transfer, you get some alignment that's not quite right. But that's a good explanation. I got a note about this from Ken Lawrence, who said that he thought it might be that ink had built up on the plate and they were trying to remove the ink. I'm not sure. It's a really unusual. If you go back to Perry's original plating, he discusses these scratches in some detail in his notes, and comments that there are more scratches between these two stamps than every other stamp on the plate.
Okay, good.
Put together. So, but that's something I'll go back and really look and see if there's some indication of double transfer on one of those two stamps.
Okay. Just to follow up to your explanation about drop letters, Ian Gregg asks, how many post offices had postmen to deliver post?
In this period, there were no people assigned to deliver. Now, there's an asterisk to that about New York and a few other towns where there were independent companies, and some postmasters had people that were delivering. But in general, there was no delivery. You went to the post office, and that made the post office a social event. People would go there, they would talk to each other, hang out, and it was kind of a gathering spot. And I'm sure the postmaster had the best gossip possible for the time. And remember, in those days, there are many people never left their local community. They were born there and passed away there. But I'm drifting away from the question.
Yes,
there were delivery. There was some delivery during this period in New York, and certainly in the next period, and in other towns. And there's a whole collecting area of these independent companies that printed their own stamps for delivery,
right,
or collection.
Yeah, actually, it's on the subject of those stamps. Robert Robson just asks, were the stamps that were in use prior to 1847, so there were some as early as 1844 and 1845, were those for internal mail only, or were they unofficial? He says that they probably weren't universally recognized and probably therefore don't count, but would you regard them as them being the very first US issue, or is it the ones from 47?
Well, I don't like to get into this argument about it. I mean, they were stamps. Actually, they were really called labels. I believe that, that's what people actually referred to them as postal labels. But they were stamps, and they were valid for postage. I think Mark Schwartz gave a really great talk to the Royal recently on the New York Postmaster Provisionals, which is what they were called. They were valid for postage in the city in which they were issued by that postmaster. This was a convenience issue, right? It would he didn't have to take the letter and collect the money at the counter. People could deposit letters at hours the post office wasn't open. But they were valid in the city in general, and they were issued in a number of cities. Like St. Louis had those stamps with bears on them, the New York provisionals. There was a number of these before 47. They were stamps, and they were accepted by the post office that issued them, and they were sent both domestically and internationally.
Okay, thank you. I think that was the final question. So I would therefore say that was the end of the Q&A session, and I'd like to hand back to Richard.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for managing that session. We move now to the vote of thanks, and it's a great pleasure for me to invite Mark Schwartz. Mark has recently been awarded the Lee Medal for the best 5 o'clock presentation to the Royal for his display of the Boston postal history of the War of Independence. Mark, it's over to you to say something about today's presentation as well. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Richard. Very much appreciated. To all fellows, members, and guests, good evening. It's nice to see you all. It's my distinct honor to extend the thanks of the Royal Philatelic Society to my very good friend, Gordon Eubanks. In the nearly 15 years I've known Gordon, we have vigorously competed quite a bit. I'm happy to say that despite that, we're still friends. We've all been treated tonight to a presentation of some of the finest US 1847 material ever amassed. I don't know whether the Royal will provide a link to Gordon's 8-frame exhibit on their website, but if not, I urge everyone to take the time to view it on the website of the US Philatelic Classic Society. It is a breathtaking exhibit. And the reason it is so good is that Gordon Eubanks is a consummate philatelist. He was already collecting and studying the US 1847 issue for quite a while when I first met him. As Richard noted earlier, he's won the US top honor, the Champion of Champions, for both his 1847 and 1851 exhibits. And the latter won the Grand Prix National in New York in 2016. While his 1847 won the Champion of Champions nearly 10 years ago, he's not slowed down much in adding to it and in continuing to do important research in the area. You've seen some of the results of that tonight. The incredible corner margin copies of both the 5 and 10-cent adhesives. The cover from Boston to Prince Edward Island and the difficult journey it had to make to get there. And that magnificent Belgian retaliatory rate cover. Gordon has patiently waited for that cover for quite a long time, I know, because he mentioned it to me the first or second time we met, and several times since. He finally got a chance to add that to his collection and exhibit in late 2018 when Bill Gross sold it. And he has shown you the other special covers tonight to mention them all. Finally, you should know that Gordon's thirst for knowledge has most recently propelled him beyond the 19th century into the 20th. One of his current passions is airmail across the Southern Atlantic during World War II. And he's applying the same thirst for knowledge to that area as he has for mid-19th century US philately. Gordon, thank you so much again for a fascinating and informative presentation.
Mark, I express my appreciation to you on behalf of everybody for that vote of thanks. It really did sum up what everybody's feeling about the display that we've seen this afternoon. Thank you very much indeed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we moved on to the next matter. And Mark Bailey, do you have the certificate available to show on screen?
Yes, I do.
To all our presenters, a memento in the form of a certificate. We can only show you the virtual example at the moment, but you will in due course receive the real paper copy in the post. We hope suitably protected. Mark, Gordon, it's there on the screen for you to see.
Thank you very much. It's and I really thank the Royal for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure. I could spend hours on the 47s. It's an amazing area, and appreciate it. Thank you, Mark. I thought we had an agreement that you wouldn't be so detailed in some of this stuff.
I kept my fingers crossed.
I'm going to get a shot to introduce you sometime or talk about you. So remember that.
Good.
It's called balancing the
Balance, yes.
a balancing act.
Yes.
Yes, once again, Gordon, thank you very much indeed. It's been a most entertaining and excellent afternoon, or evening now, should I say. Moving on then to announcements, I have one or two comments to make. They are not in the shape of announcements. I will be sending a newsletter to all members worldwide tomorrow that will contain some information about the continuation of virtual presentations in the forthcoming season for 2021-22. It will also include some additional information about the physical meetings that will start hopefully on the 24th of June and the opening of the premises. We are, of course, in the hands of the government as to whether the current restrictions will be totally lifted on the 21st of June. If there are any changes to what we expect will happen, then those changes will be communicated to all members by a President's newsletter on the day or the day after they're announced by the government. But we hope that that won't happen. We have plans in place for the meetings for the remainder of my term of office as President, and we earnestly hope that those will go forward as planned. One further note that will be in the newsletter is that the expert committee is now open for business again, and that will be mentioned in the newsletter tomorrow. Finally, the next virtual meeting, which Mark Bailey has already mentioned, is on the Thursday, the 10th of June, and that will be at 1400 hours BST, when Paul Vaynants will present mail traffic between Belgium and Spain from the accession of King Leopold I up to the GPU, and that will cover mail for the period from 1830 until 1874. Mark, I think you can now stop recording the meeting, and the meeting I will officially close. May I thank everybody for attending today. We look forward to seeing as many members as possible at the final virtual meeting of this program, and that will, as I said, take place on the 10th of June. The details for registration for that meeting will be included in the newsletter tomorrow, and registration will already have opened by the time you receive the newsletter. However, informal discussion may continue for as long as members wish it to this evening, and may I once again thank everybody for their attendance at this meeting today.